Geneva, 1940s. In the Clockmaker's quarter, every second is perfect. Until master horologist Victor Laurent is found dead in his locked atelier, poisoned by a single drop of cyanide that dripped from inside his priceless tourbillon at 8:17 p.m. sharp. The door bolted from within, the windows latched, the cognac glass bears only his fingerprints. Yet a governess with golden hair, a furious sister armed with chocolates, a German collector offering a fortune, and a trembling apprentice who inherits everything. All had alibis. Only one person knew Laurent wound his masterpiece every night at 8:15. Enter Miss Jane Marple, armed with nothing but a knitting needle and an umbrella, to prove that the perfect crime was timed to the second. Tick-tock, the heart stops, but the gears never lie. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The train from Paris to Geneva drew into the Cornavin station with the soft precision that characterized all Swiss undertakings. It was the 3rd day of October, and a light mist hung over the platforms, veiling the distant glimpse of the lake. Miss Jane Marple, descending with the assistance of a courteous porter, adjusted the angle of her neat grey hat and surveyed the scene with mild bird-like eyes. She carried a small leather suitcase and a capacious handbag of pre-war workmanship. Her travelling coat was of serviceable tweed, and her gloves, though immaculate, betrayed the careful darning of one who had never countenanced waste. A chauffeur in dark livery touched his cap. "Miss Marple, Madame Whitcomb's car." He spoke English with the careful accent of one who had learned it from gramophone records. The Daimler was spotless, its chrome reflecting the station clocks, which agreed to the second. As they glided through the streets, Miss Marple noted the orderly flower boxes, the brass plates polished to a mirror, the absence of any litter more conspicuous than a fallen plane leaf. Order, she reflected, was the Swiss religion, yet order, like charity, could cover a multitude of sins. The Clockmaker's quarter lay to the south of the old town, a warren of lanes so narrow that the Daimler proceeded at a funeral pace. Here the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and heated metal. From open doorways came the measured tick of pendulums, the faint whir of escapements, the occasional chime of a quarter hour. Tall houses leaned together like conspirators. Their windows displayed treasures. Enamel watches no larger than a sixpence, astronomical clocks with moons that waxed and waned, a skeleton timepiece in which every wheel was visible, turning with hypnotic grace. Miss Marple, who had once whiled away a wet afternoon in Danmed Village Hall, listening to a lecturer upon horology, recognized the work of Breguet, of Tompion, even a marine chronometer that might have sailed with Captain Cook. The car halted before number 14, Rue des Horlogers, a house of pale stone with green shutters and a doorway flanked by urns of scarlet. Geraniums! The bell pull produced a melodious ding-dong, and the door was opened by a maid in black alpaca and starched apron. "Madame expects you, mademoiselle." The girl's English was less assured than the chauffeur's, but her curtsy was perfect. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb awaited in the petit salon on the first floor. She had been Eleanor Ramsay in the days when Miss Marple had known her at the vicarage tennis parties, a tall girl with a laugh like a blackbird. Widowhood and 20 continental winters had silvered her hair and refined her bones, but the laugh was unchanged. "Jane, my dear." She embraced her guest with the faint fragrance of verbena. "You have not altered by a day. Come, the kettle boils." The room overlooked a courtyard where a fountain played into a stone basin. The sound was a perpetual whisper, as though the house itself were ticking. Tea was served in eggshell cups, Darjeeling, properly brewed, with paper-thin slices of lemon. Seed cake followed, and then, the cups pushed aside, Eleanor leaned forward. "You will think me an alarmist, Jane, but I am uneasy. 3 nights ago, Victor Laurent was found dead in his workshop, not 50 yards from this house. The police say poison, cyanide in his cognac. The quarter is agog with whispers, suicide, accident, murder. Victor was vain, quarrelsome, and deeply in debt, but he was not the man to take his own life, and his will—" She lowered her voice, though the maid had long since withdrawn. "He altered it a month ago. Everything, the business, the stock, even the unfinished tourbillon upon which he set such store, goes to his assistant, René Blanc, a boy he picked up in Lyons, half-starved, scarcely 25. The family is furious." Miss Marple set down her cup with care. "And the family consists of—" "His sister, Clotilde Fournier, who keeps the confectionery in the Rue de Rhône. A widow, sharp-tongued, devoted to Victor in her fashion, though they quarrelled incessantly over money. Then there is Herr Kessler, the German collector. He has been haunting the quarter for months, offering absurd sums for the tourbillon. And Miss Vale, the little English governess at number 17. She brought Victor his supper sometimes, said he forgot to eat. A pretty creature, but nervous. Miss Marple's needles. She had produced her knitting with the unobtrusive magic of long practice. Clicked softly. The police are satisfied. Inspector Duval is thorough, but Geneva is not Dame Jane. Here doors are locked at dusk. Concierges note every visitor, and yet a man may be poisoned in a room locked from within. The cognac glass bore only Victor's fingerprints and René's. The boy swears he left at 7. Clotilde admits to a quarrel at 8:30. Kessler was at his club. Miss Vale returned to her employer by 9. The poison acts swiftly, minutes, not hours. How did it reach the glass? Miss Marple gazed at the fountain, where a bronze nymph held a shell from which water dripped in perfect rhythm. Clocks and poisons, Eleanor, both require precision. Tell me, did Monsieur Laurent wind his own clocks, or did he permit others the intimacy of his mechanisms? Eleanor stared. Why, he was jealous of them. Only René was allowed to touch the finer pieces, except— She hesitated. Except Miss Vale. He boasted that she had a delicate hand. Taught her to regulate the tourbillon, I believe. Miss Marple folded her knitting. Then we must begin with the tourbillon, I think, and with the precise hour at which Monsieur Laurent was accustomed to test his evening's work. Outside, the quarter's bells struck 5, each chime a fraction behind its neighbour, as though the clocks themselves were reluctant to agree upon the truth. Chapter 2. The Workshop. The morning following her arrival dawned with the crystalline clarity peculiar to Geneva in autumn. A faint frost silvered the cobblestones of the Rue des Horlogers, and the air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread from the boulangerie opposite, and the sharper tang of heated brass from the ateliers. Miss Marple, fortified by a breakfast of café au lait and croissants of exemplary flakiness, set forth at 10 o'clock precisely, her umbrella furled like a soldier's rifle, and her sensible walking shoes making no sound upon the stones. Inspector Duval had proved accommodating once Eleanor's name was mentioned. Madame Whitcomb's late husband had rendered certain services to the Swiss authorities during the war, services that were remembered with gratitude and discretion. A laconic telephone message had secured permission for Miss Marple to view the scene of the tragedy, provided she touched nothing and remained in the company of a sergeant. The sergeant, a stolid young man named Morel, awaited her at the door of number 9, the premises of Victor Laurent, horloger. The shop front was modest, its window displaying only 3 objects: a Louis XV bracket clock with ormolu mounts, a plain silver hunter that might have belonged to a Victorian clergyman, and a modern wristwatch of stark functionality. Above the door swung a sign enamelled in blue and gold: Vie Laurent, Maître Horloger. The bell gave a single mournful ting as Sergeant Morel ushered her inside. The interior was larger than the facade suggested, extending backward in a series of interconnecting rooms. The first was the public salon, its walls lined with mahogany cabinets containing pocket watches, arranged by century, long case clocks standing sentinel like red-coated grenadiers. A faint haze of dust, inevitable in a workshop, hung in the shafts of light from the high windows. Beyond lay the atelier proper, and it was here that Victor Laurent had met his death. Miss Marple paused upon the threshold, absorbing the atmosphere as a musician absorbs the tone of a concert hall. The room was a chaos of order. Workbenches marched along 2 walls, each littered with the paraphernalia of the craft. Tiny screws no larger than pinheads, gears delicate as lace, springs coiled with mathematical exactitude. Loops and eyepieces glinted in the lamplight. A microscope stood upon a pedestal, its brass fittings polished to a buttery sheen. In the centre of the room, upon a green baize table, lay the tourbillon, a masterpiece unfinished, its cage of rubies and sapphires half assembled, the balance wheel poised like a dancer upon one toe. Sergeant Morel cleared his throat. Monsieur Laurent was discovered here, mademoiselle, seated upon that stool, his head fallen forward upon the bench. The glass, he indicated a small table to the right, stood thus. The bottle of cognac was upon the shelf yonder. Both have been removed for examination. Miss Marple advanced slowly, her gaze sweeping the room with the meticulous care she ordinarily reserved for the village rummage sale. The cognac glass had left a faint ring upon the wood, and within it a residue of brownish sediment. Beside the ring, almost invisible against the dark oak, was a smear of greenish patina, verdigris perhaps, from a faulty escapement. She bent closer, her nose wrinkling at the faint lingering scent of bitter almonds. Cyanide, Morel confirmed, anticipating her question. Prussic acid, to be precise. The quantity was sufficient to kill within minutes. And the door? Miss Marple inquired, straightening. Locked from within. The key was in the deceased's pocket. No other exit save the window, and that was fastened with a patent latch that cannot be opened from without. The concierge, Madame Binet, sits in her lodge opposite. She swears no one entered after René Blanc departed at 7 o'clock. Miss Marple's eyes travelled to the window. It overlooked a narrow alley where dustbins stood in orderly array. The latch was indeed of the modern sort, requiring a special key. She noted, however, that the lower pane bore a faint smudge, as though a gloved hand had rested there momentarily. At that moment, a slight sound, a nervous cough, drew her attention to the farther bench. A young man had risen, sketchbook in hand, his face pale beneath a shock of dark hair. He wore a leather apron over a neat worsted suit, and his fingers were stained with ink and oil. René Blanc, Morel introduced curtly, the assistant. Rennie bowed with the awkward stiffness of one unused to English gentlewomen. "Mademoiselle," he murmured. His accent was Lyonnais, softened by years in Geneva. I was completing an inventory. The police have finished, but Monsieur Laurent was particular about his records." Miss Marple regarded him with mild benevolence. "You have been with Monsieur Laurent long?" "5 years, mademoiselle. He found me in Lyon, apprenticed to a watchmaker who drank. Monsieur Laurent said I had the touch." His voice trembled with pride and something else. Fear, perhaps. He was a hard master, but just, and now he gestured helplessly at the tourbillon. "You poured his cognac that evening?" Renée flushed. "No, mademoiselle. I left at 7. Monsieur Laurent preferred to work alone after that hour. He said the silence helped him think, but I prepared the bottle earlier. Remy Martin, his favourite. I left it upon the shelf with a clean glass. He disliked dust in his liquor." Miss Marple's gaze returned to the green smear. "And this verdigris? It was not here yesterday, I think." Renée followed her eyes. "That is from the escapement of a bracket clock. English, early 19th century. Monsieur Laurent was restoring it for Herr Kessler. The pivot had corroded. I cleaned it myself this morning." "Yet the smear is upon the bench where the cognac stood," Miss Marple observed gently. "Curious, when the bracket clock is upon the far table." Renée opened his mouth, closed it again. A bead of perspiration appeared upon his upper lip, despite the coolness of the room. Sergeant Morel intervened. "The fingerprints upon the glass were yours, and Monsieur Laurent's only, Blanc. Explain that." I handled the glass when I washed it yesterday morning," Renée stammered. "Monsieur Laurent disliked lipstick marks. He was fastidious." Miss Marple moved to the tourbillon. The mechanism was mounted upon a brass pillar, its cage open to reveal the intricate dance of wheels. One screw was missing from the plate. The aperture gaped like a missing tooth. "This screw," she said, pointing with the tip of her umbrella. "It is absent. Was the piece in this condition when you left?" Renée hesitated. "Monsieur Laurent removed it himself. He said the balance was running slow. He intended to adjust it after supper." "Supper?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Who brought Monsieur Laurent his supper?" "Usually no one. He forgot to eat when working. But that evening," Renée's voice dropped, "Miss Vale came, the English governess. She brought a tray, cold chicken, a little salad. She often did so. Monsieur Laurent said she had a light hand with mustard. And she remained long. Perhaps half an hour. They spoke in the salon. I heard laughter. His, not hers. Then she left by the front door at 8:30, I think. Madame Fournier arrived shortly after. She and Monsieur Laurent quarrelled about money, always money. Her voice carried to the street. Then silence. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the tourbillon, not quite touching. Within the cage something caught the light, a thread perhaps, or a hair. She produced a small magnifying glass from her handbag, an instrument she had found invaluable at jumble sales, and bent closer. The object was a single strand of pale gold, finer than silk. "Curious," she murmured. "Monsieur Laurent's hair was dark, was it not? And yours, Monsieur Blanc, is black as jet." Renée stared, transfixed. Sergeant Morel leaned forward, his stolidity cracking into interest. At that moment, the door from the salon opened to admit Inspector Duval himself. He was a thin, dark man with the air of a disappointed bloodhound, his moustache waxed to rapier points. He greeted Miss Marple with formal courtesy. "You find something, mademoiselle?" "Merely a hair, Inspector, but hairs, like alibis, have a way of belonging to someone." Duval's eyes narrowed. The laboratory examined the glass and bottle. No hairs, no fibres, yet here. He peered through the magnifying glass. Blonde? Miss Vale, perhaps? "Or another," Miss Marple said mildly. "Tell me, Inspector, at what precise hour was the tourbillon last wound?" Duval consulted his notebook. René Blanc states that he wound all the public clocks at 6:30. The tourbillon is delicate. Monsieur Laurent himself wound it each evening at 8:15, when he tested the day's adjustments. The mechanism was found running, the hands indicating 8:17. It stopped shortly after death. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the missing screw. 8:17. 2 minutes after the accustomed time. A discrepancy of 2 minutes in a craftsman's life. And yet, in those 2 minutes, a man died. She straightened, folding her magnifying glass with a snap. "I should like to speak with Miss Vale, Inspector, and with Madame Fournier, and perhaps with Herr Kessler, who covets the tourbillon so ardently. Clocks, like people, keep their own counsel until questioned properly." Duval bowed. "As you wish, mademoiselle. But remember, the door was locked, the windows fastened, the poison swift. We deal with a miracle, or with a murderer of exceptional cunning." Miss Marple smiled. A small, inscrutable curving of the lips. "Miracles, Inspector, are merely murders that have not yet been explained." Outside, the quarter's bells began to strike 11, each chime overlapping its neighbour in a cascade of bronze. Somewhere in the atelier, a cuckoo emerged from its painted door, called thrice, and retreated. Miss Marple listened, her head tilted like a bird's, and in the silence that followed she heard another sound, the faint, almost imperceptible click of a mechanism that had not quite finished its work. Chapter 3. The Suspects. The afternoon was well advanced when Miss Marple emerged from the workshop, her umbrella tapping a thoughtful rhythm upon the cobbles. Sergeant Morel had been dispatched to summon Miss Vale. Inspector Duval, with the air of a man who distrusts coincidences, had taken the golden hair to his laboratory. Miss Marple, declining the offer of the police car, preferred to walk. Movement, she had long ago discovered, loosened the mind as effectively as it eased the joints. The Clockmaker's quarter, bathed in pale October sunlight, presented a facade of tranquil industry. Apprentices in leather aprons hurried between ateliers with parcels wrapped in oilskin. A woman in a fur violet shawl polished a brass pendulum until it glowed like the sun itself. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed the tremor of gossip, the quick glance, the half-heard whisper. Murder, even in a city that prided itself upon discretion, was a stone dropped into still water. Her first call was upon Madame Clotilde Fournier, whose confectionery occupied a corner site where the Rue des Horlogers met the Rue du Rhône. The shop window was a temptation of the senses. Pyramids of marrons glacés, coils of black chocolate laced with orange, sugared violets arranged like jewels in a tiara. A bell of Viennese workmanship tinkled as Miss Marple entered. Madame Fournier was behind the counter, tying a box of pralines with scarlet ribbon. She was a woman of 50-odd, stout without being gross, her black dress relieved only by a cameo brooch, and the flower upon her capable fingers. Grief had not dimmed the sharpness of her eyes. If anything, it had honed them. "You are the English lady staying with Madame Whitcomb," she stated rather than asked. "Come about my poor brother, no doubt. Sit, sit. The police have pored over everything. One more pair of eyes will make little difference." She led Miss Marple to a small parlour at the rear, where the air was thick with vanilla and burnt sugar. A samovar hissed gently upon a spirit lamp. Beside it stood a plate of macarons, the colour of primroses. "Victor was a fool," Madame Fournier declared, pouring tea with more force than ceremony. "A genius with wheels and springs, but a child with money. Debts, always debts. And then to leave everything to that boy. René Blanc, who would not know a breguet from a turnip. My chocolates paid for his apprenticeship, did they tell you that? I lent him thousands, and he laughed. 'Keep your bonbons, Clotilde,' he said. 'I have time on my side.'" Miss Marple accepted a macaron. It dissolved upon the tongue like a sigh. "You visited him that evening?" "At 8 o'clock. I wished to discuss the new will. The notary had written to me. Imagine my feelings. We quarrelled, yes. He called me a vulture. I called him an ingrate. I left at 8:30, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Ask Madame Binet. She heard every word. And the cognac?" Madame Fournier shrugged. "Victor drank it like water. I saw the bottle upon the shelf, half empty, as usual. I poured nothing. My hands smell of almond paste, not bitter almonds." She held them out, broad, scrupulously clean. "If I had wished to poison him, I should have used arsenic in the ganache. Quicker, and he would have eaten it with pleasure." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You knew of the tourbillon?" "Everyone knew. Kessler offered 200,000 francs, enough to pay Victor's debts twice over. But no, he must finish it for some museum in London. Vanity. He said it would make his name immortal. Immortal." She laughed, a sound like cracking toffee. "Now, is immortal in the police morgue." From the confectionery, Miss Marple proceeded to number 17, a narrow house with a balcony overflowing with ivy. The governess, Miss Valerie Vale, was taking the air with her charge. A sturdy boy of 7 engaged in propelling a hoop along the pavement. Miss Vale herself was slight, fair-haired, with the translucent skin of those who spend too much time indoors. She wore a dove-grey coat and an expression of controlled anxiety. "Miss Marple, the maid said someone wished to speak with me." Her voice was low, educated, with the faintest trace of the Midlands. "Henri, go to nurse. There's a good boy." The child departed with reluctance. Miss Vale led the way to a small sitting-room on the ground floor, its walls papered in faded cabbage roses. A doll's house stood in one corner, its front open to reveal rooms furnished with exquisite minuteness. "You are kind to come," Miss Vale began, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "The police, they asked so many questions, I scarcely knew what to answer." "You were fond of Monsieur Laurent." A flush rose to her cheeks. "He was kind to me. In a place where kindness is measured in francs, that is much. He taught me to wind the clocks, said I had steady hands. The tourbillon fascinated me. It is like a heart, beating without a body." "You brought him supper on the night he died." "Yes, cold chicken, a little salad. He worked late and forgot to eat. I arrived at 7:30, left at 8:30. Madame Fournier came as I went. She passed me on the step. I heard them begin to quarrel before I reached the corner." Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the doll's house. Upon the miniature dining table stood a tiny silver tray bearing a chicken carved from balsa wood. "You have a pretty talent for miniatures." Miss Vale smiled faintly. "It amuses Henri, and it helps me to understand mechanisms, how small things fit together." "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently, "did you ever adjust the tourbillon yourself?" "Once. Monsieur Laurent was indisposed. He had taken brandy after luncheon and slept in his chair. The balance was running slow. He asked me to turn the regulator a fraction. I was nervous, my hands shook, but he praised me afterward." Her eyes filled with sudden tears. "He said I might have been a Holliger's daughter." Miss Marple rose. "You returned home by 9? My employer, Madame Reynaud, was expecting me. She is particular about hours. The concierge logged me in at 8:50. As Miss Marple descended the steps, the hoop bowled past again, propelled by Henri. It struck the railing with a metallic clang and rolled into the gutter. Miss Marple stooped to retrieve it, noting as she did so a faint scratch upon the enamel, fresh, as though it had struck something harder than stone. Her final visit was to Herr Kessler, whose residence in the Place du Cirque was a bastion of Teutonic severity. The door was opened by a manservant in green baize who might have stepped from a Prussian barracks. Herr Kessler received her in a study lined with glass cases, pocket watches, carriage clocks, a magnificent astronomical timepiece with dials for the phases of the moon. He was a tall man, lean as a blade, with a monocle that flashed like a signal lamp. "Fräulein Marple, your reputation precedes you." His English was impeccable, his manner clipped. "You come about the unfortunate Laurent, a tragedy for the art of horology, if not for the man." "You desired the tourbillon?" "Desired? I offered a princely sum, 200,000 Swiss francs. Laurent refused. He wished to present it to the British Museum. Posthumous glory, you understand. But the piece is unfinished. Without his hand, it is worthless." He gestured to a photograph upon the desk. The tourbillon in an earlier stage, its cage complete, but the escapement missing. "I have the mate to this mechanism, a Breguet of 1801. Together they would be unique." "You saw Monsieur Laurent that day?" "At 4 o'clock. We discussed terms. He was adamant. I left in anger. Yes, I admit it. But I was at my club from 6 until midnight. The porter, the steward, 20 members will vouch for me." Miss Marple studied the photograph. In the background, almost obscured by shadow, stood a figure, slight, fair-haired, bending over the bench. "Who is this?" Kessler adjusted his monocle. "The governess, I believe. She was often there." Laurent boasted of her skill. Outside, dusk was gathering, the street lamps flickering into life like cautious conspirators. Miss Marple walked slowly back to Eleanor's house, her mind turning over the pieces of the puzzle, as a watchmaker turns a wheel upon its pivot. Madame Fournier's anger, René's fear, Miss Vale's tears, Kessler's frustration, each was a cog in the mechanism. But where was the mainspring? And who had set the machine in motion? In the courtyard fountain, the bronze nymph still poured her endless stream, and from the atelier opposite came the faint, persistent ticking of clocks that refused to acknowledge that their master was dead. Chapter 4. The Alibi. Inspector Duval's office in the Palais de Justice was a room of austere modernity that jarred against the quarter's antiquity. Grey steel filing cabinets marched along one wall. A map of Geneva, pricked with coloured pins, occupied another. The inspector sat behind a desk bare, save for a telephone, a green-shaded lamp, and a dossier bound in red tape. He rose as Miss Marple entered. offering a chair with the courtesy due to a lady who had once dined with the prefect of police. "You wish the precise times, mademoiselle?" He opened the dossier. "I give them gladly. We Swiss are slaves to the clock." He laid before her a sheet of paper ruled in columns, names, movements, witnesses. The handwriting was neat, almost architectural. René. Blanc left the atelier at 7 o'clock exactly. Madame Binet, the concierge, observed him from her lodge. He carried a parcel, tools returned to a supplier in the Rue de la Croix d'Or. The supplier's clerk confirms receipt at 7:12. Miss Valerie Vale arrived at 7:31, according to the same Madame Binet, who is partial to English governesses and notes their comings with affection. Miss Vale departed at 8:29, passing Madame Fournier on the threshold. Madame Fournier remained until 8:41. Her departure was noisy. She slammed the door with sufficient force to dislodge a bracket clock from its shelf, witnessed by the apprentice in the shop opposite. Herr Kessler was at the Club des Banquiers from 6 until midnight. The hall porter logged his arrival at 6:03. The steward served him a trout amandine at 7:15. 20 members played cards with him until the small hours. The poison, potassium cyanide, was administered between 8:15 and 8:20. The autopsy fixes death at 8:22. The tourbillon, found running, stopped at 8:17. Laurent himself wound it each evening at 8:15 precisely. The habit was invariable. The glass contained a residue of cognac and cyanide. Fingerprints, Laurent's on the base, René's on the rim, explained by the washing of the previous day. No other prints. The bottle, Remy Martin 3/4 full, showed no trace of poison in the liquid remaining. The cork, however, was impregnated with a crystalline deposit. Cyanide dissolved in alcohol, applied with a brush perhaps. Miss Marple studied the sheet. The cork? Interesting, is it not? The bottle stood upon the shelf, cork beside it. Laurent disliked a dusty cork. He wiped it with a silk cloth before pouring. The poison, therefore, entered the glass when the cork was replaced after the previous evening's drink. But who replaced it? René swears he left the cork upon the bench. Miss Vale says she saw it beside the bottle. Madame Fournier noticed nothing. And the door was locked from within? Duval nodded. Key in Laurent's pocket. The lock is a Brammer, impossible to pick without special tools. The window latch was fastened, the catch is stiff and leaves a mark upon the thumb, no mark upon Laurent's hands. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Yet someone entered after 8:41, and left before the body was discovered at 10 by René, who returned for a forgotten loop. 2 hours unaccounted for. Precisely. Duval leaned forward. The concierge saw no one. The alley behind is a cul-de-sac. The dustbins were undisturbed. We're left with a locked room, a poisoned cork, and 4 suspects whose alibis appear unbreakable. Miss Marple folded the paper. Alibis, Inspector, are like clock faces. They show the time one wishes to see. But the mechanism behind may run fast or slow. She rose. May I see the cork? Duval produced a glassine envelope. The cork was of pale Spanish cork, the top stained with age. Upon the underside, faint but visible, was a crystalline bloom, like hoarfrost. Applied with a camel hair brush, Duval said. The laboratory confirms it. But whose brush? Miss Marple turned the envelope in the light. Monsieur Laurent cleaned his own brushes? René cleaned them. but the camel hair is used also by gilders. Miss Vale, I believe, assists Madame Reynaud with the illumination of menus for dinner parties. She has access to cyanide, for gilding, she says. A silence fell, broken only by the ticking of Duval's wristwatch. A modest Longines, accurate to the second. "One more thing," Miss Marple said. "The tourbillon stopped at 8:17. Yet Laurent wound it at 8:15, 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, a man may drink, replace a cork, and die. But why did the clock stop?" Duval shrugged. "The poison, perhaps. Convulsion dislodged the balance. Or," Miss Marple said softly, "someone stopped it deliberately, to fix the time of death." She took her leave, descending the marble staircase of the Palais, with the measured tread of one who has seen a crack in the facade of certainty. Outside, the evening mist was rising from the lake, curling like cigarette smoke around the gas lamps. Miss Marple paused at the corner of the Rue de Rhône, where a clockmaker's apprentice was setting the hands of a public timepiece. The boy glanced at her, touched his cap, and moved the minute hand forward by 3 minutes. "Running slow, mademoiselle," he explained. "The cold contracts the metal." Miss Marple watched him adjust the regulator, a tiny screw no larger than a pinhead. 3 minutes. In the atelier, 2 minutes had meant the difference between life and death. She walked on, past the confectionery where Madame Fournier was drawing the shutters, past number 17, where a light burned in Miss Vale's sitting room. In the window of Herr Kessler's house, a shadow moved, tall, monocled, impatient. At Eleanor's door, she paused, listening. From the atelier opposite came the faint chime of a quarter hour, then silence. Somewhere in the quarter, a clock was striking 9, 3 minutes fast or 3 minutes slow. Time, Miss Marple reflected, was the perfect accomplice. It never spoke, yet it remembered everything. Chapter 5. The green-stained night had folded itself over the clockmaker's quarter like a velvet glove. The gas lamps along the Rue des Horlogers burned with a steady, amber glow, and the cobbles gleamed with the damp of a recent shower. Miss Marple, escorted by Eleanor Whitcomb, returned to the atelier at 9:30. Inspector Duval had granted permission for a second private examination. The official seals were removed, and Sergeant Morel stood sentinel at the door with the air of a man who would rather be at home with his slippers and his wife's onion soup. The workshop was lit by a single green-shaded lamp upon the central bench. Shadows leapt and retreated among the half-assembled mechanisms, giving the room the aspect of a cavern where time itself lay in fragments. The tourbillon, still upon its brass pillar, caught the light and threw it back in 100 tiny, restless sparks. Eleanor shivered. "It feels colder than last time, Jane, as though the clocks resent our presence." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was studying the bench where the cognac glass had stood. The faint ring left by the base of the glass was now a pale circle against the dark oak, and within it the greenish smear, verdigris, Renée had said, had been joined by another mark. A perfect shallow depression, no larger than a sixpence, as though a small bottle had rested there briefly and been removed. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Renée is meticulous. He polishes the benches each morning with beeswax and turpentine. This ring is fresh, the wax has not yet filled it. And the stopper of the cognac bottle, where is it?" Morel produced it from his pocket, wrapped in tissue. The cork was as Duval had described, pale, age-stained, with the crystalline bloom upon the underside. but Miss Marple's attention was upon the top. There, almost invisible, was a minute speck of the same green patina. She held it to the lamp. Verdigris upon the cork, yet the bottle stood upon the shelf yonder, cork beside it. How did the verdigris travel? Eleanor peered over her shoulder. Might it have fallen from the ceiling? There is an old bracket clock above the shelf. English, Renee said. The pivot was corroded. Miss Marple climbed upon a stool, steadying herself against the bench. The bracket clock was a handsome piece, mahogany case, gilt dial, the maker's name, Volume, London, faintly legible. The pendulum hung motionless. The escapement showed the green bloom of neglect. But the corrosion was confined to the pivot. None had fallen to the shelf below. No, Miss Marple said, descending. The verdigris was carried, upon a finger perhaps, or upon the base of the bottle itself. She moved to the shelf. The cognac bottle had been returned for the purpose of reconstruction. It stood 3/4 full. The label, Remy Martin, fine champagne, peeled at one corner. The base was clean, but upon the shelf, directly beneath where the bottle had stood, was another faint ring, and within it a single perfect fingerprint in green. Morel whistled softly. That was not there this morning. I dusted the shelf myself. Miss Marple took a small envelope from her handbag, and with the tip of her umbrella, lifted the print onto a sheet of notepaper. A thumb, I think, and the ridges are interrupted, here and here, by the characteristic whirls of a craftsman who works with fine tools. Renee's hands are stained with ink and oil, but this is verdigris. Someone handled a corroded pivot, and then the bottle. Eleanor's eyes widened. But Renee left at 7. The fingerprint is fresh. Precisely. Miss Marple turned to the tourbillon. The missing screw had not been replaced. The aperture gaped. She produced her magnifying glass and bent close. Within the cage, wedged between the balance wheel and the palette fork, was a scrap of paper no larger than a postage stamp. With infinite care, she extracted it with tweezers. The paper was thin, almost tissue, and upon it, in a hand both delicate and hurried, were the words, "The gears turn, but the heart stops." Eleanor read over her shoulder. "A threat? Or a confession?" Miss Marple said. "The ink is sepia, watchmaker's ink used for marking dials. Renee uses black. This is finer, almost violet under the lamp." She slipped the paper into an envelope. And now, the mechanism itself. With Morel's assistance, she lifted the tourbillon from its pillar. The base was heavy brass, the cage open. The balance wheel, exquisitely poised, oscillated once as she tilted it, then stopped. A faint click sounded from within. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor asked. Miss Marple tilted the cage again. The click repeated, sharper this time. She peered into the depths. Between 2 ruby jewels, something glinted, glass, no larger than a pinhead, and within it a bead of liquid that caught the light like a tear. "A vial," Morel breathed, "embedded in the mechanism." Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Not embedded, Sergeant, lodged. The screw was removed, the vial inserted, the screw replaced loosely so that vibration would dislodge it. When the tourbillon was wound at 8:15, the vial tipped. The liquid, cyanide, I fancy, ran down the pillar and into the glass, which stood upon the bench beneath. The clock stopped at 8:17 because the balance was fouled by the screw falling free." Eleanor stared, but the glass was on the side table, not beneath the pillar. Originally, yes, but someone moved it, after the poison was released, perhaps, to disguise the method. Or the glass was placed there deliberately, the bench being used for the winding. Laurent was a creature of habit. Morel examined the pillar. Upon the brass, directly beneath the cage, was a tiny stain, colourless, but with the faint, unmistakable scent of almonds. Miss Marple straightened. The vial is cracked. The poison escaped in a single drop, sufficient, with cyanide, to kill. The screw was pocketed as a trophy, or lost in haste. And the verdigris, she indicated the fingerprint, came from the bracket clock. Someone handled the corroded pivot, then the bottle, then the tourbillon. A delicate operation, requiring steady hands. Eleanor's voice was hushed. Miss Vale, or another with access and skill. Miss Marple's eyes were bright. But the note, the sepia ink, points to someone familiar with the atelier's materials. And the hair we found earlier, blonde, fine. Miss Vale is fair. Madame Fournier is dark. Renée darker still. Herr Kessler, she smiled faintly. Herr Kessler wears a toupee, I observed. The hair is too uniform. Morel pocketed the envelopes. I will take these to Duval. The vial, the print, the note, but the locked door. Miss Marple moved to the window. The latch was stiff, but with a twist of her umbrella handle, she opened it. The window swung inward upon silent hinges. No scratch upon the sill, she noted, yet the latch leaves a mark upon the thumb. Whoever opened it wore gloves, or had no need of the latch, because the window was already unfastened. She closed it again. Laurent worked late. He may have opened the window for air. The murderer entered thereafter, performed the deed, and left the same way. The alley is narrow. A shadow would scarcely be noticed. Madame Benet's lodge faces the front. Eleanor shuddered. But the risk? Murder is always a risk, Miss Marple said, but a calculated one. The tourbillon was the perfect instrument. Laurent's pride, his nightly ritual. The murderer knew he would wind it at 8:15, that the glass would be beneath, that the poison would act before he could cry out. She gazed at the mechanism, now silent upon the bench. A clock within a clock. The heart stops, but the gears turn a little longer. Outside, the quarter's bells struck 10, each chime a fraction apart, as though time itself were reluctant to agree upon the hour. Miss Marple listened, her head tilted, and in the hush that followed she heard the faint, persistent tick of a mechanism that had not yet revealed all its secrets. Chapter 6. The revelation dawn crept over the clockmaker's quarter with the tentative grace of a thief. A pearl-grey mist rose from the lake, muffling the chime of the first matin bells and turning the narrow lanes into silver corridors. Miss Marple, who had passed a restless night with her bedroom window open to the courtyard fountain, was already astir. She had bathed, dressed in her dove-grey travelling costume, and consumed a solitary cup of coffee before the household stirred. At 6 o'clock precisely, she slipped out of Eleanor's house, umbrella in hand, and made her way to the atelier. The police seals had been replaced, but Sergeant Morel, forewarned by a telephone message from Eleanor, awaited her with a key. He looked as though he had slept in his uniform. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his salute was crisp. "You are early, mademoiselle. Truth is an early riser, Sergeant. It dislikes being kept waiting." Morel unlocked the door. The workshop was dim, the green lamp extinguished, the tourbillon shrouded in a dust sheet. Miss Marple moved at once to the central bench. She lifted the sheet, revealing the mechanism exactly as they had left it. The cage open, the balance wheel fouled by the fallen screw, the cracked vial glinting like a malevolent eye. She produced a small torch from her handbag, borrowed from Eleanor's chauffeur, and directed its beam into the heart of the tourbillon. The vial was wedged between the pallet fork and the escape wheel. The glass was hair-fine, the liquid within almost spent. With tweezers, she eased it free. It was no larger than a grain of rice, yet it had contained death. "Enough cyanide to kill a man in 30 seconds, Morel murmured. "Or a woman," Miss Marple corrected. "The dose is calculated to the drop. Observed the crack. Deliberate. Made with a diamond point, I fancy." The vial was inserted, the screw loosely replaced. Vibration from the winding key did the rest. She placed the vial in a pillbox lined with cotton wool. "Now, the screw." Morel produced it from an envelope. It was a tiny thing, steel, with a slotted head. Upon the thread was a faint smear of verdigris. "From the bracket clock," Miss Marple said. "The pivot was corroded. The murderer handled it, then the screw, then the vial. The verdigris transferred. But the fingerprint upon the shelf, whose is it?" Morel hesitated. "The laboratory worked through the night. The ridges match Miss Vale's right thumb. She has a scar. Here," he indicated a break in the whorl. "From a childhood accident with a sewing machine. It is unmistakable." Miss Marple nodded. "Then we must speak with Miss Vale. But first, the note." She unfolded the scrap of tissue paper. The gears turn, but the heart stops. The ink under the torch beam showed a faint violet sheen. "Sepia," Morel said, "but diluted with water. Watchmaker's ink is thicker. This was thinned to flow through a mapping pen." "Or a quill," Miss Marple said. "Miss Vale illuminates menus. She would have both." They left the atelier as the quarter stirred to life. Bakers' vans clattered over the cobbles. A milk float jingled its bells. At number 17, the shutters were still closed, but a thin blade of light showed beneath the kitchen door. Morel knocked. After a moment, the maid appeared. Aproned, flower on her cheek. "Miss Vale! She's in the park with Master Henri. They left at 5:30. The child wished to see the swans before breakfast." Miss Marple and Morel exchanged glances. The park lay across the Rue de Rhône, a formal garden with gravel paths and an ornamental lake. They reached it in 5 minutes. The mist still clung to the water. The swans moved like ghosts. Henri was feeding them crumbs from a paper bag, his hoop forgotten against a bench. Miss Vale sat nearby, her coat unbuttoned despite the chill, her face pale as parchment. She rose as they approached. "Miss Marple, Sergeant, you are abroad early." "As are you, my dear." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her eyes were steady. "We must talk about the tourbillon." Miss Vale's hand flew to her throat. I know nothing. You know a great deal," Miss Marple interrupted. "You have steady hands and a delicate touch. Monsieur Laurent trusted you with his masterpiece. You adjusted the regulator once when he was indisposed. You knew he wound the tourbillon each evening at 8:15, that the glass would be beneath to catch the balance. You prepared the vial, cyanide from your gilding kit, cracked it with a diamond from Madame Reynaud's brooch, inserted it with the screw removed. You handled the corroded pivot to disguise the verdigris upon your fingers. You wrote the note in thin sepia to suggest a watchmaker's hand, and you left the golden hair, your own, to be found later, when suspicion had settled elsewhere." Miss Vale swayed. Henri, sensing distress, ran to her. "Nanny, go to nurse, darling," she whispered. The child hesitated, then obeyed. Morel stepped forward. "Valerie Vale, I arrest you. Wait! Miss Marple raised a hand. Let her speak. The child is gone. Miss Vale sank onto the bench. Her voice, when it came, was a thread. He promised to marry me. In the spring, he said, when the tourbillon was finished. He gave me a ring, paste, but I believed him. Then Kessler offered the money, and Victor laughed. A governess for a wife? You are a child's toy, Valerie. Amuse me until the museum pays. I went to him that evening to plead. He was drunk already. He kissed me, then pushed me away. Wind the clock, little mechanic. That is all you are good for. She covered her face. I had the vial in my pocket. I had prepared it for myself if he refused me. But when he turned his back, I unscrewed the plate, inserted it, replaced the screw loosely. I poured the cognac, harmless then, and left. Madame Fournier arrived as I went. I heard them quarrel. I walked until 9, then returned home. The concierge logged me in. I thought the clock would stop at 8:17, and they would blame René or Kessler. But you— She looked at Miss Marple with something like wonder. You saw the vial. Miss Marple's voice was soft. You moved the glass afterward, to the side table, to disguise the drip. But you forgot the verdigris upon the cork, and the fingerprint upon the shelf, and the screw. You kept it, did you not? In your pocket as a trophy. Miss Vale reached into her coat. Morel tensed, but she drew out only the tiny steel screw, green-flecked, and laid it upon the bench. I thought it would bring me luck, she said. Instead, it brought you. Morel handcuffed her with gentle firmness. You will come with me, mademoiselle. She rose without resistance. As they walked away, Henri's hoop rolled forgotten into the lake, bobbing once before it sank. The swans glided over the ripples, serene and indifferent. Miss Marple remained upon the bench. The mist was lifting. The sun struck the water in 1,000 points of light. She thought of Victor Laurent, vain and cruel, and of the girl who had loved him enough to kill. Time, she reflected, was a cruel master. It gave with one hand and took with the other, and no one, not even a clockmaker, could wind it backward. At 8 o'clock she returned to Eleanor's house. The quarter was fully awake now. The ateliers hummed, the confectionery's shutters were raised, the scent of fresh bread mingled with the sharper tang of heated metal. Life went on, precise and unhurried, as though a man had not died in a locked room with a drop of poison in his glass. Eleanor met her in the hall. It is over. It is over, Miss Marple said. The gears have stopped turning. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The arrest of Valerie Vale passed through the Clockmaker's quarter like a chill wind through a keyhole. By noon the news had reached every atelier, every confectionery, every concierge's lodge. The police van that removed her from number 17 was observed by 20 pairs of eyes. The child Henri, bewildered and tearful, was carried indoors by his nurse, his hoop abandoned in the gutter. Inspector Duval, with the air of a man who had solved a puzzle only to discover it was the wrong one, issued a brief statement to the press. A tragic affair now concluded. The Geneva police extend their gratitude to Miss Jane Marple of England for her invaluable assistance. Miss Marple herself spent the morning in Eleanor's petit salon, writing letters upon lavender notepaper and declining all visitors. The quarter, for once, was denied the spectacle of the English lady's departure. She had no taste for triumph. Murder, however neatly explained, left a stain no beeswax could remove. At 2 o'clock, Inspector Duval called, hat in hand. He laid a small parcel upon the table. "The tourbillon, mademoiselle. The museum in London has withdrawn its claim. The piece is incomplete without Laurent's final adjustments. René Blanc wishes to finish it in his memory. He asks your permission to dedicate it to you." Miss Marple unwrapped the cloth. The mechanism lay there, cage closed now, the balance wheel restored, the cracked vial replaced by a ruby jewel. It ticked softly, a sound like a heartbeat. "It is beautiful," she said, "but beauty can be dangerous. Let René keep it. Dedications are for the living." Duval bowed. "And the others?" "Madame Fournier inherits her brother's debts and her pride. She will pay the one with the profits of the other." Herr Kessler returns to Munich, disappointed but philosophical. He has purchased the Vulliamy bracket clock instead. The verdigris, he says, adds character. René, poor boy, has the business and the burden of a name he did not earn. He will succeed, I think. He has the touch. And Miss Vale? Miss Marple folded her knitting. She has confessed. The trial will be swift. The evidence is complete. Cyanide, the vial, the screw, the fingerprint, the note. She will hang or serve a long sentence. In either case, she has lost more than her liberty. Duval hesitated. "You pity her." "I pity anyone who mistakes love for possession. Monsieur Laurent was cruel, but cruelty is not a capital offence. Miss Vale made it one." The inspector departed. Outside, the quarters bells struck 3, each chime precise, unhurried. Eleanor entered with a tray of coffee and the inevitable seed cake. "You leave tomorrow, Jane. The morning train. I have imposed long enough." Eleanor set down the tray. "You unravelled it like a tangled mainspring. How did you know it was the tourbillon?" Miss Marple poured coffee with steady hands. "Clocks are truthful, Eleanor. They record what men forget. The stopped hands at 8:17, the missing screw, the verdigris upon the cork. These were the ticks that did not belong. And Miss Vale, she taught the child with the doll's house. Miniatures within miniatures. She understood how small things fit together to make a larger whole." She sipped her coffee. "People are like clocks. Wind them with flattery, and they run fast. Wind them with despair, and they strike at the wrong hour." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You will miss Geneva. I shall miss the precision, but not the secrets." At 4 o'clock, Miss Marple took a final walk. The atelier was locked. A new sign in the window. Art Blanc, Maître Horloger, Réparation et Création. René, pale but composed, was arranging pocket watches in the cabinet. He bowed as she passed. The confectionery was closed. Madame Fournier had gone to the bank to negotiate terms. Herr Kessler's house stood shuttered, the manservant polishing the brass plate for the last time. At number 17, the ivy had been trimmed. A new governess, brisk and competent, was teaching Henri his letters upon the balcony. Miss Marple paused at the park. The swans glided upon the lake. The hoop had been retrieved and repainted. A single white feather floated upon the water, turning slowly in the current. She returned to Eleanor's house as dusk gathered. The fountain in the courtyard played its endless melody. The geraniums glowed scarlet against the stone. In the atelier opposite, a light burned, René at work, the tourbillon upon his bench, ticking toward completion. Dinner was quiet. Eleanor pressed a box of pralines into her hands. "For the journey, Jane, and for the memories." Miss Marple smiled. "Memories are like clocks, Eleanor. They keep their own time." The evening train to Paris departed at 9. The Daimler conveyed her to the station through streets washed clean by a shower. The platform clocks agreed to the second. As the train pulled out, the lights of Geneva receded, the lake a dark mirror reflecting the stars. Miss Marple settled into her corner, the pralines upon the seat beside her. Outside, the Alps rose black against the sky. She opened her handbag and took out the tiny steel screw, green-flecked, that Miss Vale had surrendered. She turned it in her fingers once, then let it fall into the waste-paper basket. "Time marches on," she murmured, "and takes its secrets with it." The train gathered speed. Somewhere behind, the quarter's bell struck 10, precise, indifferent, eternal.